In the winter of 1846, 17 souls vanished along the Underground Railroad between Philadelphia and New York. Officially, they were recaptured, quietly forgotten. But buried beneath 179 years of lies is a different truth, one carved into hidden church ledgers, one whispered through backroom archives too dangerous for daylight. They weren't caught by chance. They were delivered, sold, by a girl they trusted. Margaret Thorne, 16, a Quaker, raised among abolitionists. Pale, quiet, pious, a perfect daughter in a family that risked everything for strangers seeking freedom. She served them bread, prayed with them, hid them under floorboards. But behind that porcelain face, she was counting every fugitive like currency. Each man, each woman, each trembling child represented a price tag, a future, a dowry, a way out. What you're about to hear isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a blueprint of how manipulation cloaks itself in righteousness, of how systems built to save can be turned inside out by one hungry soul. Margaret didn't just betray the cause of freedom, she monetized it, operationalized it, weaponized compassion, and used it as camouflage. And she got away with it. For over a century, her descendants burned the records, paid off historians, rewrote her name out of Pennsylvania's abolitionist legacy. But secrets rot in the dark, and eventually they leak. Tonight, we exhume the corpse of a legacy and show you the girl science couldn't explain, because she didn't defy science. She sold her soul and sold freedom for a future in silk. Most men believe evil announces itself, with blood, with violence, with monstrous faces, but the worst evil wears linen gloves, bows politely, and offers you soup. Margaret Thorne was born into a world of soft prayers and silent sacrifices. Her family farm in Chester County, Pennsylvania was more than a home. It was a node in one of the most secretive resistance networks in American history, the Underground Railroad. You need to understand what that meant in 1846. It meant danger. Every knock at the door could be death. Every candle in the window could be a signal or a trap. And every fugitive taken in meant risking your home, your land, your life. But the Thornes, they believed in the cause. They were Quakers, abolitionists, soldiers without weapons in a war for freedom. Their farmhouse had false floors, trapdoors, secret root cellars. Every corner whispered escape. And Margaret, she saw it all, listened, memorized, learned. At 14, she could recite the safe house routes from Maryland to New Jersey. At 15, she guided runaways through snow-covered trails with the precision of a military scout. People trusted her because she looked like innocence made flesh. Pale blue eyes, auburn hair tucked neatly under her bonnet, voice like velvet over scripture. No one questioned her, and that was their mistake. Because Margaret wasn't grateful for the purpose her family had given her, she resented it. While her peers in Philadelphia tried on dresses and whispered about husbands, Margaret's hands were raw from baking bread for strangers. Her favorite china was shattered by fugitives, her best linens torn into bandages, and the money, God, the money, bled from her father's coffers into the hands of smugglers and corrupt sheriffs, all to keep strangers hidden another day. She watched her life being bartered for causes she didn't choose. And then came the final insult, a suitor, a promise, a future. Torn away the moment his father learned who the Thornes really were. That was the moment something broke, or maybe something awoke. Margaret didn't become evil in one breath. No. She studied it. Like scripture, she saw what others called humanity and renamed it opportunity. She began to count lives in coin. And what happened next was not vengeance. It was a business plan. By the autumn of 1845, Margaret Thorne wasn't mourning the loss of her suitor. She was plotting her emergence, not as a wife, not as a daughter, but as something far more dangerous, an invisible predator cloaked in the garments of virtue. She began listening differently, watching differently. Where others saw the Underground Railroad as salvation, Margaret saw a supply chain, routes, timetables, vulnerabilities. Assets in motion. She didn't see fugitives anymore. She saw inventory, a moving stock of desperate, exhausted human beings, men with strong backs, women with skilled hands, children who could fetch a premium if young enough, unbroken, and in the southern slave markets, they were worth real money. Margaret started keeping notes, quietly, precisely, who passed through, when, what they could do, how much they might sell for, not in dollars, in gold. But she needed a partner, and fate, as it often does when darkness is ready to rise, delivered one. His name was Jeremiah Caldwell. Not your average slave catcher. He didn't snarl, he didn't shout. Caldwell was silk and steel, a man who moved through Wilmington's back alleys and port taverns with the calm confidence of someone who had made a science out of betrayal. Where others beat their victims, Caldwell preserved them, healthy, quiet, valuable. He didn't hunt fugitives, he harvested them. And Margaret? She didn't just admire him, she understood him. In November of that year, under the pretense of shopping for kitchen supplies, Margaret slipped away from her father at the Wilmington Grain Exchange. She walked alone, bonnet drawn low, into a portside tavern called the Anchor's Rest, a nest of thieves, smugglers, and slavers. She ordered weak tea and listened. And in that smoke-choked room, filled with laughter and human trafficking, she heard Caldwell's name again and again. His captures were clean, his information divine. Margaret made her move. 2 weeks later, she approached him, not as a girl, but as a partner. She didn't beg. She offered data, a list, a name, a route. And when Caldwell's men captured 3 fugitives the next week, precisely where and when she predicted, he realized what he'd found. A spy inside the abolitionist network, a saboteur in a Quaker dress, a golden knife in the spine of the Underground Railroad. That night, they struck their first deal, $50 per head. No violence, no noise, no suspicion, just clean betrayal. December 15th, 1846. The first snow had buried Chester County in silence, a white shroud that muffled footsteps and erased tracks. To most it was just a storm, but to Margaret Thorne it was cover, a curtain behind which she would write her first chapter in blood and gold. 5 fugitives arrived at the Thorne farm that night, frozen, filthy, near collapse. 3 men, 1 woman, 1 boy, 12 years old. His name was Joshua. Margaret greeted them with hot soup and soft smiles. She helped warm their hands, tucked blankets around their shoulders, whispered prayers as they cried with relief. Her parents beamed with pride. Their daughter was becoming a leader in the fight for freedom. But inside her apron pocket was a sealed note. Coordinates, timings, physical descriptions, sent to Caldwell days earlier. That night, Margaret volunteered to escort the fugitives herself to the next station, 15 miles northeast, a place she claimed had better shelter, warmer stoves. Her parents trusted her completely. Why wouldn't they? They gave her the best horse, the family's covered wagon, and their blessing. And before sunrise, Margaret was gone, guiding 5 souls through a blizzard, straight into a trap. 2 miles into the forest, the road narrowed between trees. A fallen oak, split by lightning the summer before, marked the ambush site. Caldwell's men were already waiting, hidden, patient, ruthless. They didn't need whips or dogs. They had Margaret. The fugitives were on foot, tired, trusting. They didn't suspect until the snow exploded around them and the shouting began. Clubs swung, Ropes snapped, screams tore through the woods. Joshua ran toward the wagon, toward Margaret, arms outstretched. "Help me!" he screamed. She didn't move. One of Caldwell's men struck the boy across the face to silence him. Margaret didn't flinch, she didn't cry, she didn't blow. Ink. She watched. And when the last body was dragged away, Caldwell climbed into her wagon and placed something heavy in her lap. A sack of gold coins. $250. More than her father earned in a year. Payment for 5 lives. Margaret turned the wagon around, rode home through the blizzard, lied effortlessly. And that night, as her parents slept peacefully under their quilts, Margaret sat alone in her room, counting the money by candlelight. Smiling, not with guilt, with purpose. By the time the first rumors reached Wilmington, it was already too late. 5 fugitives, gone, no trace, no warning. And the worst part? It happened during a blizzard, a time when travel should have been impossible, even for seasoned slave catchers. That fact alone chilled the blood of every conductor on the Underground Railroad. Someone knew the route, knew the timing, knew the names. Whispers of betrayal began to slither through the abolitionist network. Trust withered. Safe houses closed their doors, routes were shifted, secrets that once passed through firelight and scripture now fell silent. Every eye watched the trees, every knock at the door was met with hesitation. But no one looked at Margaret. She was untouchable, too pure, too devout. The Thornes were legends, Quakers whose farm had harbored dozens. Margaret's lies were wrapped in scripture and baked into bread. She described the delivery of the 5 fugitives in exquisite detail. The smiles, the gratitude, the hymns sung in freedom. Her performance brought tears to her mother's eyes. No one suspected that while others mourned the loss of the fugitives, Margaret was already planning her next delivery. She'd discovered something more intoxicating than gold: control. And with each betrayal, she didn't just grow bolder, she grew smarter. She began building what she would later call her freedom ledger, a hidden notebook tucked beneath the false bottom of her hope chest. In it, Margaret mapped everything: conductor schedules, safe house weaknesses, physical descriptions of fugitives, even estimates of their auction value based on age, strength, and skill. She studied southern slave market fluctuations, the way merchants study grain prices. She noted that young men fetched more near planting season, skilled workers sold higher in port cities, and pregnant women were especially valuable. 2 lives for the price of 1. This wasn't just sabotage, it was enterprise. Caldwell paid handsomely for the intel. Other catchers, less refined, began hearing rumors of a ghost informant, someone whose tips always hit. They never met Margaret. Caldwell protected her identity like a trade secret. And back in Chester County, she remained the angel of the farm. Daughter of light, protector of the oppressed. But in truth, she was no longer a girl. She was a system, a living breach inside the heart of America's most sacred resistance, and she was just getting started. The Underground Railroad had always relied on one thing: trust. Silent, sacred, unshakable. A look, a knock, a hymn. Lives were passed hand to hand in the dark based solely on belief that the next soul wouldn't break the chain. Margaret knew that, and she twisted it into a noose. After the blizzard betrayal, suspicion began to boil. Conductors knew something was wrong. The precision of the ambush, the perfect timing. It couldn't be luck. Someone was leaking. But who? That's when Margaret made her next move. A distraction. A sacrifice. His name was Elias Hawthorne, a traveling Methodist preacher with a silver tongue and a righteous fire that lit every barn he stepped into. He spoke of justice, deliverance, and the burning need to shelter the fleeing. For months, he'd been holding revival meetings across Chester County, raising money, delivering sermons, and, importantly, asking questions. Too many questions. Margaret saw her opening. At a Quaker gathering one cold evening, she lowered her voice and planted the seed. Told two neighboring families she'd seen someone watching their barn, a man in dark clothes, tall, bearded. Could have been that preacher fella, she said, but maybe I'm mistaken. She wasn't mistaken. She was strategic. Within days, conductors were whispering, Elias is too curious. He's asking for maps. Who's funding him? It didn't take long for fear to take hold. Hawthorne went from prophet to pariah in less than a month. Margaret stoked every fire, nodded at every rumor, confirmed nothing, but watched. And when Hawthorne was blacklisted from the region entirely, forbidden from setting foot in the homes of abolitionists who once welcomed him like family, Margaret smiled. The chain of trust had been broken, but not in the way the others feared. They thought they'd caught the traitor. They were wrong. The real traitor was still loving soup, still praying over children, still memorizing every fugitive's face as if she were preparing a eulogy. But there would be no graves, only invoices. And Margaret's books were already open. She had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. If you want to remain invisible, give them someone else to burn. Spring of 1847 brought more than thawed snow and blooming trees. It brought opportunity. For most, the season meant renewal, but for Margaret Thorne, it meant supply chain optimization. Fugitives moved more frequently in spring, faster, in larger groups. Longer daylight meant longer journeys, warmer weather meant higher spirits, and more trust. Trust, now her favorite currency. Margaret had turned her father's farmhouse into a spider's web, and she was the silk. She kept her ledger hidden inside a false-bottomed hope chest, a gift from her mother. Inside, there were no dresses, no wedding plans, no trinkets from a girlhood now long dead, just maps, numbers, flesh for cash equations. The details were staggering. She'd documented every safe house between Baltimore and New York, color-coded them by security strength, marked which families were sympathetic but sloppy, which were noble but naive. She knew which conductors drank too much, who flirted with danger, who trusted the wrong neighbors. She didn't just know the system. She was the system. And in that ledger, beneath inked names and silent values, were notes like, boy 10, strong arms, obedient, potential blacksmith, Est, $250, Charleston. Woman, pregnant, second trimester, midwives markets, Savannah, Est, $400 for both. To the world, Margaret was a helper of the helpless. To herself, she was an entrepreneur, working in human potential. She even tracked market trends, which cities paid more in spring, where younger boys fetched premiums, what skills were rising in value, sewing, cooking, woodworking. She studied the Southern economy the way others studied scripture. She wasn't saving souls. She was sourcing them. And all the while, she prayed louder than anyone. When other Quakers hesitated to risk their farms, she volunteered. When families feared raids, she offered her barn. She became more trusted than ever, because trust, she'd learned, grows best in soil watered with performance. And that trust bought her time, space, access, data. Margaret wasn't a girl anymore. She was an intelligence network in a dress, an algorithm before the age of algorithms. And in the darkness behind the farm, beneath the roots of piety and silence, a machine had begun to hum. To the outside world, the Underground Railroad was a miracle of conscience. Brave men and women risking their lives to defy the machinery of bondage. But like any system built on human hands, it had vulnerabilities. Margaret Thorne found them all. She understood something the others didn't. Even the purest hearts still follow patterns, and patterns once mapped can be monetized. She started tracking time. How long conductors stayed at each station, how often they reused trails, who lingered too long in town, who lit a lantern when they thought no one was watching. She began to see the movement of fugitives not as chaos, but as a rhythm. And rhythm is predictable. By April, her ledger read like a tactician's journal. She could predict when a group would arrive within an hour. She could anticipate who would escort them. She even began to script the timing of betrayals, spacing them just far enough apart to avoid suspicion, but close enough to keep the money flowing. Each entry was clinical, emotionless, calculated. Delay delivery, too soon after Feber storm. New group from Elkton scheduled May 9th, Caldwell, prep ambush at Flint Hollow. The network never saw her coming. While others improved security by moving fugitives under new cover, Margaret offered to hold them temporarily. Buy time, she claimed. Let the new plan settle. She'd host them at her family farm, provide food, warmth, prayer, always prayer. But she wasn't buying time. She was selling it. Caldwell would be alerted within the hour, payment negotiated in advance. Sometimes, if the market dipped, she'd delay the betrayal a day or two, let the value rise. She wasn't just selling people, she was playing futures. The Underground Railroad became her personal stock exchange. Every escape attempt, an investment opportunity, every trust placed in her, a deposit in her growing empire. And every prayer she whispered over a runaway child, was another coin in the darkness. She had become the perfect parasite, invisible, necessary, and fatal. And no one, not the conductors, not her parents, not even Caldwell, understood the depth of her ambition. Because Margaret didn't want to just profit off slavery. She wanted to own the game. It was a warm evening in late May when Margaret first met Virgil Stokes. He arrived unannounced, tall, pale, impeccably dressed, with the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself to command a room. Margaret was serving supper to her parents when the knock came. 3 taps, then silence. She answered the door, candle in hand. His first words? "You're not just some farm girl, are you?" She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply stepped aside and let him in. Stokes wasn't like Caldwell. He didn't stink of whiskey and fear. He didn't bark orders or wave coin purses. He spoke of logistics, of scalability, of opportunities beyond Pennsylvania. He wasn't a hunter. He was a businessman. And he'd heard of Margaret's work. Whispers of the ghost operator who never missed a target. Of the invisible betrayal network disguised as a devout Quaker girl. Stokes had come with a proposal. Not a partnership. A promotion. "You're wasting your talent," he told her. "Selling to men like Caldwell is small time. They trade in bodies. I deal in routes, infrastructure, entire supply lines." Margaret said nothing at first, just poured his tea and listened. Stokes continued. He had access to southern plantations that were overstocked and in debt. He had ships, agents, corrupt officials. He spoke of turning her betrayal model into a reverse railroad, a system for catching escapees and relocating troublemakers from plantations to where demand was higher. "Don't just sell flesh," he whispered. "Sell efficiency." That night, long after her parents went to bed, Margaret and Stokes sat at the kitchen table drawing maps, real ones, arteries of capture and commerce. He showed her how she could scale her network across 3 states. He even had code names for her. White Wren, Chalice, North Star's Eye. She chose none of them. "I already have a name," she said. "Margaret Thorne." It was the first time she ever claimed it out loud. With pride. By morning, a new alliance had been born. Colder, cleaner, more professional. Caldwell was kept for local deliveries, but Stokes would make her national. She wasn't just selling runaways anymore. She was building a corporate structure for betrayal, with quotas, reports, delivery points, and projected revenues. The Underground Railroad had its heroes. Now it had its CEO. The first to join her wasn't a stranger. It was Silas Thorne, her brother. To the world, Silas was a simple man, bookish, quiet, believer in the light. He wrote poetry, kept bees, and never looked a man in the eye for too long. People assumed he was weak. But Margaret knew the truth. He wasn't weak. He was waiting. Silas had long resented their father's obsession with spiritual duty over profit. The family farm had lost money for 3 straight winters because of its open-door policy for fugitives. He saw them eat their bread, sleep in their barn, vanish with their blankets, and leave the Thornes one harvest closer to ruin. So when Margaret showed him the ledger one night, laid it open on the kitchen floor by candlelight, he didn't look away. He looked deeper. She explained everything, the codes, the transactions, the patterns. Then she placed a coin in front of him. Southern Mint, clean, silver. "From the girl who left last Tuesday," she said softly. "Her name was Sarah." Silas didn't ask questions. He just nodded. From that moment on, he became her first operator. His role? Simple. Cleaner. When a fugitive stayed too long or asked too many questions, Silas distracted them with stories or sedatives hidden in warm milk. When Margaret needed to falsify a record or move a body before a new group arrived, Silas did it without a word. No sermons, no hesitation. And Silas wasn't alone for long. Next came Annabel Wicks, the spinster schoolteacher who ran the town's Sunday classes. No one suspected a woman who sang hymns to children would double as a surveillance node. But Margaret paid her well to listen for whispers, to identify households where suspicious travelers stayed too long. Annabel sent updates by letter, folded in Bible pages. Then came Deacon Rudd, a former abolitionist turned bitter after his son was caught helping fugitives and lynched in Tennessee. Rudd didn't just switch sides, he enjoyed it. Margaret gave him a new purpose, vengeance disguised as penance. Each member served a function. Each had a price. But none ever saw Margaret's full plan. Only she held the master ledger. Only she could read the full symphony of betrayal. They thought they were part of something dark. They didn't know they were part of something eternal. A network built not just to catch, but to endure. It started with a hymn. Late one evening, Margaret's mother, Eleanor Thorne, sat alone by the fireplace, humming an old spiritual she hadn't heard since she was a girl. A song passed to her by a woman she once helped hide in the cellar during a thunderstorm. A song of hope and warning. But that night, the song felt off. Because she'd heard it earlier, whistled by a boy in Margaret's care, just hours before he vanished. No goodbyes, no second lantern lit on the post, no thank you, just silence. Eleanor asked Margaret about him. She gave the usual answer. They moved early, new route, safer that way. The tone was perfect, the lie clean. But something had changed in her mother. She had begun to notice. There were too many arrivals with no departures, too many shoes left behind, too many stories Margaret dodged with ease. Eleanor, long used to being excluded from her daughter's deeper dealings, now began to listen, not as a mother, but as a witness. And then, one night, she followed her. It was past midnight. Margaret had claimed she was heading to Annabel Wicks's home for an emergency message, but Eleanor wrapped herself in her late husband's wool cloak and trailed her barefoot a full mile through the trees. What she saw chilled her beyond words. Margaret wasn't alone. She was standing by the old stone bridge, speaking with a man Eleanor had never seen before, tall, pale, dressed like a banker, not a farmer. They didn't argue. They negotiated. Eleanor could only make out fragments. "To coming Tuesday. Strong, young, Carolina blood. Double if unbranded." She staggered back in the dark, heart pounding. She didn't know if she was seeing a dream or a nightmare. The girl she raised, the child who used to cry over injured sparrows, was now bartering children. Eleanor waited until dawn before confronting her. Margaret didn't lie. She didn't weep. She simply said, "You taught me to survive, Mother. I just took it further than you could stomach." That was when Eleanor made the first real mistake of her life. She told Margaret she'd go to the elders. Margaret didn't beg. She just nodded and offered her tea. By nightfall, Eleanor Thorne would sleep the eternal sleep. Her death was ruled as sudden heart failure. The town mourned. Margaret wept at her funeral. Silas delivered the eulogy, but only one soul in that church knew the truth, and she was the one wearing Eleanor's wedding brooch. His name was Josiah Bell, 15 years old, barefoot, sharp-eyed, born in bondage on a Virginia plantation and escaped north with his sister under cover of rain. They arrived at Margaret's farm 3 months before Eleanor's death. The girl, Miriam, was sold to Caldwell the same night. But Josiah, he was supposed to vanish. Silas had been sloppy, too tired, too soft. He'd tied the knot poorly. Josiah slipped out of the cellar during the 3rd hour of night, sprinted barefoot into the marshes behind the Thorne property, and kept running until the pain in his legs overtook the fear in his lungs. He should have died out there. But he didn't. 3 days later, he stumbled into a Quaker settlement near the Delaware border, blistered, shivering, delirious. A kindly widow took him in, nursed him back to strength. And when he could finally speak, his story came out like shattered glass. Slow, painful, sharp. The elders listened. Some believed. Most did not. They knew the Thorne family. They had trusted Margaret for years. Josiah was just a boy, they said, frightened, confused. Perhaps he was fed lies by slave catchers to sow discord. Perhaps the trauma had warped his memories. After all, Margaret had done so much good. Still, one elder, Thomas Ireton, wasn't satisfied. He'd known Eleanor, knew her heart, and something in her sudden death, the way it came without warning, haunted him. So when Josiah spoke of a ledger hidden in a hope chest beneath the floor, Ireton didn't dismiss it. He went to the farm himself. Margaret welcomed him with warmth, poured his tea with honey, asked about his arthritis. But he noticed it, the glint of steel in her eyes, the careful way Silas hovered by the back door, the slight scuff on the floor near the parlor, freshly swept but uneven. He didn't ask to see the chest, he asked to borrow it, said he was helping build a historical archive for the meeting house. Margaret paused, smiled. "Of course," she said. "Anything for the truth." That night, the chest arrived at Ireton's home. Emptied. Clean. Hollow. No false bottom. No ledger. And Josiah? He vanished from the settlement 2 nights later. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. No farewell. But the widow who sheltered him swore she saw it. A pale man in a black coat by the well that evening, watching her window. Virgil Stokes, the ghost of Margaret's empire, always one step ahead. The truth had nearly surfaced. And now, it was sinking again. She had always believed in destroying the past. Erase it, rewrite it, burn it if you must. But Margaret forgot something. Even fire leaves behind ashes. 2 weeks after Josiah's disappearance, a traveling preacher arrived in town. Reverend Elias Moore, a soft-spoken black man from Ohio with a strange talent. He memorized books. He came not to preach, but to catalogue. The old meeting house had hundreds of uncategorized letters, sermons and diaries from decades past. Moore offered to organize them as a gift to the faith. Margaret approved the project personally. It was the perfect gesture of piety. What she didn't know was that inside a tattered folder, misfiled under Winter Donations 1837, Reverend Moore would find something she thought had been destroyed long ago. A page. Not the whole ledger, just one torn leaf. A single parchment, water-damaged and half-charred, folded 4 times into the spine of an old sermon titled, On Mercy and the Breaking of Bread. It bore no name, no date, but the handwriting. It was hers. Reverend Moore didn't know who Margaret Thorne was, but he knew codes. He'd seen documents like this smuggled out of Georgia by bleeding hands. He'd helped decode letters sewn into garments. He recognized the rhythm. 3-letter initials, timestamps, Latin notations, freight-style weights, and a final line at the bottom. M confirmed, S to deliver, ET absent. Payment 3x standard, 2 unmarked. He didn't understand it all, but he understood enough. Someone in this town wasn't a savior. They were a broker. Moore quietly copied the page and tucked it into his Bible. He didn't alert the elders, not yet. He wanted context, wanted to be sure. But he made one mistake. He asked Annabel Wicks about Eleanor Thorne. Just a casual question, over tea. Did she ever keep ledgers, diaries? Annabel smiled, then wrote a letter. To Nen. Nights later, Reverend Moore's inn caught fire. They said it was an accident, candles, paper, heat. But the townsfolk found something strange in the ashes, a melted silver brooch. Not Moore's, not the innkeeper's. They said it resembled one once worn by Eleanor Thorne, and behind the church, tucked into the hollow of a tree, was a Bible with 1 page missing. Margaret was at the service the next morning, black veil, hands folded, eyes cast low. But when the congregation sang, "Abide with me," she didn't move her lips. She only watched, because the fire had done its job, mostly. But Margaret Thorne was no longer calm. Someone out there still had something. And worse, someone was getting close to understanding her system. It began with a pause. Margaret kept everything timed to the second. Candlelight visits, coded letters, supply drops hidden in root cellars. Every operator had a schedule. Every whisper had a weight. So when Deacon Rudd was late delivering the March manifest, she didn't get angry. She got curious. Rudd was never late. Brutal, yes. Sadistic, certainly. But punctual, always. Margaret sent Silas to his homestead. The report came back strange. The deacon was home, quiet, sweating, and digging. Not in the fields, in the woods behind his house. He said it was for a fence post, Silas muttered. But there's no lumber nearby, just shovels, and his left hand was trembling. That was all she needed. Margaret called a circle supper, a rare event, all key members together in one room. Wicks, Silas, Rudd, even Virgil Stokes returned from whatever pale corner of the world he haunted. They met in the parlor of the Thorne farmhouse, candles lit, wine poured, Margaret made stew. She even laughed, once. But no one felt at ease. The air was wrong. Annabel Wicks coughed nervously and asked, "Shall we pray before the meal?" Margaret smiled. "Of course," she said. They all bowed their heads. Then Margaret slammed her hand on the table, hard. Cutlery jumped, wine spilled. "Someone," she said, "has misplaced my name." Silence. "Someone," she continued, "let a page escape. Someone told that preacher where to look. Someone is close to unraveling us, and I intend to find out who." Still, no one spoke. She stared at Deacon Rudd. "I hear you've taken up gardening," she said, voice smooth as glass. "Is that where you buried your loyalty, Deacon?" He swallowed, but said nothing. Margaret stood, drew a folded paper from her apron, laid it gently on the table. It was a replica of the burned page, identical to the one Reverend Moore had found, the one only 5 people had ever seen in its original form. "I made copies," she whispered, "just in case." Annabel's breath hitched. Rudd shifted in his chair, and Silas, for the first time, looked afraid. Then Margaret turned to Virgil Stokes. "Show him," she said. Virgil stood, slow and deliberate. From his coat he drew a leather pouch, and from it Deacon Rudd's signet ring. still attached to a finger. Everyone froze. "Found it in the soil," Virgil rasped, "right where he was digging." Rudd's chair scraped as he lunged. But Margaret was faster. The knife she'd used to dice potatoes was already in her hand. It sank into Rudd's throat with a wet, precise sound. Blood hit the Bible Annabelle was clutching. Rudd gurgled once, then collapsed. Margaret wiped the blade on her apron. "Loyalty," she said softly, "isn't given, it's earned every night." The others didn't eat. No one moved. But from that moment on, Margaret knew fear had returned to the table, and fear was loyalty's shadow twin. His name was Caleb Thorne. 19. Her nephew, Eleanor's grandson, smart, quiet, too observant for his own good. Margaret had raised him after the fever took his mother, schooled him in languages, mathematics, even coded scripture. By 17 he was transcribing sermons in Greek and planting decoys for the underground network. He was loyal, devoted. The boy called her aunt, but revered her like a queen. And that was the problem. Caleb started asking questions, at first harmless ones. Why do we change routes so often? Or, why does Silas carry the delivery box into the barn alone? But soon, the questions deepened. Why don't I ever see where the passengers go? Why does Mr. Stokes only visit at night? Why was Deacon Rudd never buried? Margaret always had answers, clean, believable ones. But Caleb had Eleanor's eyes, and Eleanor's habit of listening when no one thought he was near. One night he heard Annabelle Wicks whisper something that changed everything. 3 children this week. That ledger's too full, Margaret. We'll run out of codes. Ledger. Children. Codes. Caleb's stomach turned. He waited until dawn, then went to the barn. Found the cellar door Silas always kept locked. Found the spare key. Found more than he ever should have seen. Chains. Blankets. A brand still warm from the night before. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He memorized everything. Then he packed a satchel, stole a horse, and vanished into the trees, just as his grandmother once did, many years before. By sundown, the farm was on lockdown. Silas rode north. Virgil took the southern woods. Margaret herself stood at the edge of the field, eyes fixed on the horizon, the brooch at her throat trembling. "Find him," she said. "Bring him back. Alive." Not out of mercy. Out of necessity. Because Caleb knew everything. Codes, names, locations. He had read the ledger. He had seen the faces. And if he made it to Philadelphia, if he reached a court, a church, a press, anything, the Thorne Empire would fall, not by flame, but by testimony. He rode for 3 days without rest. Through rain, thickets, open moonlight. The pain in his ribs faded into a rhythm. The fear in his lungs hardened into resolve. Caleb had memorized a route from Margaret's maps. An old trail north, used only in winters. Abandoned, she'd said. Dangerous. But he had no choice. He reached Philadelphia on the 4th night, mud-splattered, starving, eyes swollen from wind and smoke, but alive. And he had a name, Jonas Kells. The one man Margaret feared by name, once a Quaker, now an abolitionist firebrand, excommunicated for radical defiance. Eleanor had mentioned him in her journals, said he could be trusted if the hour is darkest. Caleb found him in a cellar beneath a clockmaker's shop near 3rd Street. The brass sign read, H. Crowley Sons. No such family existed. Caleb knocked 3 times, paused, then 2 more. A latch opened. A man with grey eyes stared out. "You're late," he said. Inside, the air was cold but safe. A handful of men, some armed, some scarred. They nodded at Caleb like he was already known. He told them everything, not just the crimes, the structure, names, drop points, the false sermons, the codes. He gave them the truth in a firestorm of words. When he finished, Jonas stood and said quietly, "God help her. She's built a machine of flesh." They locked the doors, began compiling the evidence. Caleb handed them the burnt copy of the ledger, the one he'd recovered from Margaret's desk drawer before fleeing. It was enough to hang a dozen men. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. One of the men, a tall, nervous youth with ink-stained fingers, stepped outside to fetch records. He never returned. That night, the bell above the shop door rang once. Just once. The room went silent. Every man turned. But it wasn't Margaret. It wasn't Silas. It was a young woman. No older than Caleb, cloaked in mourning black, skin pale as candle wax, eyes like a funeral veil. She said her name was Miriam, and that she had once escaped a place called Thorne Farm. Everyone sat up. Jonas whispered, "You were the girl, Josiah's sister." But Miriam just smiled faintly, then dropped a cloth bundle onto the table. Inside it, Josiah's broken compass, the one he had carried when he fled, the one found buried beside a tree near the Delaware border and stolen from a Quaker widow's drawer just days after the preacher's death. Everyone looked to Caleb. Miriam met his eyes and said, "She knows you're here." It happened at 2:19 a.m. The night was quiet. Jonas was asleep. Caleb was rereading his notes. Miriam sat near the hearth, stitching something small, a ragged piece of cloth, pale blue. Then came the sound. Glass. Breaking. Not a crash. A slice. A window on the second floor. Silent. Intentional. Jonas jerked upright. Caleb froze. They'd posted a sentry at the stairs. A big man named Wallace, armed, alert. But Wallace never called out. He never screamed. Because what came through that window didn't walk. It slid, silent as oil, fast as shadow, and it wore Silas's face. Only Caleb saw him fully, just for a breath, as lightning cracked the sky through the window. A long black coat, a knife so thin it shimmered, eyes empty, unblinking, focused only on one thing: Caleb. Jonas grabbed a rifle, fired. Silas didn't flinch. The bullet struck him, but not deep. He moved like sinew, like a man carved to absorb pain. He lunged at the desk, tore through papers, sliced open the satchel, found nothing. Then his head turned, locked on Caleb. The boy ran. Jonas shouted, "Go! Down the back!" Miriam grabbed Caleb's hand. Together they burst into the darkened cellar and kicked open the coal hatch. Rain slammed their faces. Thunder rolled. Behind them a scream. Short. Brutal. Jonas. Dead. They ran through the alley, boots splashing through sewer water. A horse neighed in the distance. A bell rang once. And somewhere in the storm, Caleb swore he heard it. A whistle. 3 tones. The Thorne signal. They were everywhere. They had planned this. Not just Silas, but others. Embedded. Bribed. Bought. The city wasn't safe. Nowhere was. As they fled toward the wharf, Miriam clutched her bundle tighter. Caleb shouted, "What's in that?" She said nothing, just ran. But when they reached the river, Miriam finally turned to him. "We can't go to the press, he said. "We can't go to the court. They're all too slow." "Then what?" Caleb gasped. Miriam opened the cloth. Inside was not just the compass. There were 2 pages, One was the copy of Margaret's ledger. The other, older, faded, was a birth certificate. But not for Caleb. For a girl named Margaret Ellen Cartwright, born 1805. Mother, Eleanor Thorne. Father, unknown. Caleb's mouth fell open. "No," he whispered. "That's impossible. She said she was Eleanor's niece." Miriam met his gaze, her voice like iron. "She lied. She's not the heir. She's the firstborn." They hid in a fisherman's loft above the river, waiting for daylight. Miriam hadn't slept. Caleb couldn't. He kept staring at the birth certificate, the ink, the date, the handwriting. Margaret Ellen Cartwright, born April 16th, 1805. Mother, Eleanor Thorne. Father, no name. Just a black dash where a father's identity should be. Caleb whispered. She said Eleanor was her aunt, that she was born in Georgia. Miriam shook her head. No. She was born in a house that burned 3 days later. Midwives were murdered. Records buried. But someone kept this. She tapped the certificate. My brother found it. Josiah. Caleb looked at her sharply. That was your brother. She nodded, face tense. He followed Margaret's paper trail. Found this in a Quaker vault outside Baltimore. He sent me the pages. 3 days before he vanished. Now Caleb understood the fire in her eyes. It wasn't just rebellion. It was vengeance. Then she said the words that cracked everything open. She's not building an empire, Caleb. She's covering her origin. He didn't understand. So Miriam opened the second page, the ledger. But it wasn't the names that chilled him. It was the last column on the far right. Written in faint ink, each entry had a corresponding name. And beside each name, a coded symbol, a triangle, a cross, a circle, sometimes 2 together. He had always thought they were markers, classifications. But Miriam pointed to the very first entry. Margaret Ellen Cartwright, April 16th, 1805, symbol C+S. Caleb blinked. That's her own name. Miriam nodded. She wasn't recording others. She was recording herself. Every identity, every alias. Every time she changed her name or forged a new path, she added it to this ledger. Caleb leaned in. C+S. What does it mean? Miriam said nothing, just turned to the final page. The ink was darker, fresher. One last entry had been scrawled, dated only a week ago. The name, Caleb Thorne. Next to it, S, no, C, only S. What's that mean? He whispered, dread pooling in his chest. Miriam looked at him with hollow eyes. C is for those who are claimed. S is for those who are sacrificed. Rain lashed the rooftops as Caleb stared at the name, his name, inscribed in Margaret's own hand, beside a symbol that meant only one thing, sacrifice. He could barely breathe. I'm not part of this, he stammered. I didn't choose. Miriam cut him off. No one chooses. That's the point. She flipped back through the pages. There are over 200 names here. Children, runaways, workers, missionaries. All of them thought they were part of something righteous. All of them ended up with an S. Caleb backed away. This doesn't make sense. Why keep a record? Why write it all down? Miriam held his gaze. Because Margaret doesn't kill them. She gives them. A silence spread between them. Then Miriam stepped to the window and opened the latch. A gust of wind blew in, rattling the lantern. You ever hear of the Hollow Church? She asked. Caleb's stomach turned. That's a myth. No. She shook her head. It's real. She pulled a second, older page from her coat. Thin parchment, singed at the edge, on it an etching, almost medieval. A tree without leaves, roots like black veins, and beneath it a circle of stones. In the center, a woman in a veil, kneeling. At her feet, a ledger, identical to Margaret's. Above her, a figure with no face, only teeth. It's older than the farm, older than the abolition network. The hollow church was never about freedom. It was a trade. They gave names, in exchange for protection. From what, I don't know. But it always required two things. She pointed to the symbols again. C, for claimed, the ones who served, the ones marked to continue the line, and S. She let the word hang, then finished. They die, and something else feeds. Caleb's hands were trembling. She wouldn't. That's madness. But in his heart he knew she would, because Margaret believed, not in God, not in freedom, but in debt, in the oldest kind of transaction. Blood. For power. Suddenly, below the window, a voice rose in the rain. A girl, singing. A nursery rhyme, barely audible through the storm. Circle wide and circle deep. What we take, we always keep. Ashes white and ledger red. One for life and one for dead. Miriam went pale. Caleb looked out the window. There were children. 12 of them, standing in a circle. In the street, eyes closed, their palms bleeding. Then, a tall figure stepped into the center of the circle, cloaked, veiled, silent. Miriam whispered, choking on her own breath. It's begun again. She's calling them back. The wind rose like a scream. Below them, the children didn't move. They stood barefoot in the mud, arms out, blood dripping from slit palms onto cobblestones. Rain washed it away, only for more to flow. In the center, the cloaked figure knelt. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Miriam collapsed. Caleb caught her before her head struck stone. She's calling, she whispered, eyes unfocused. She's using their blood to call it out. What is it? Caleb demanded. But Miriam couldn't speak. Her body shook. Then he heard it. A low hum. Not music. Not human. It was beneath the rain. Below the city. Like it was rising from the earth itself. A frequency. A voice that had no sound, but still spoke. It said, over and over, like a chant, like a hunger. Then something changed in the room. The ledger began to smoke. Not burn, smoke. From the inside. Caleb grabbed it, tried to close it. The pages resisted. Miriam shot upright and shouted, "Don't close it!" Too late. As he slammed it shut, every child below screamed in unison, not in pain, in defiance. Their heads snapped upward, and from beneath their feet the ground began to crack, not like stone breaking, like roots moving. The stones of the street lifted, rearranged, forming a perfect circle. Inside it, the cloaked woman stood, and for the first time, she looked up. Her face was not Margaret's, but it was not human. It was smooth, almost polished, like bone beneath stretched wax. No mouth, no nose, only two black hollows for eyes. Caleb backed away from the window. "This isn't Margaret," he breathed. "This is what she serves." Miriam nodded, trembling. "Every S is for sacrifice, but every C," she looked at him, "is for continuation." Caleb froze. "She doesn't just kill the S," Miriam said. "She inherits the C. That's why you're in the ledger. You weren't just raised, you were prepared." Lightning struck across the harbor, illuminating a shape above the water. A ship. No sails, no crew, just a long black hull drifting against the current. And on its deck, a single coffin. Carved with the Thorne sigil, the intertwined C and S. Miriam turned to Caleb. "She's sending for you," he whispered. "Why?" And Miriam, cold as stone, replied, "Because your blood isn't just part of this. Your blood is the key." They moved at dawn. Caleb and Miriam, cloaked in mud and fear, followed a smuggler's path out of the city. They dared not speak of what they'd seen. The ship, the children, the cloaked thing in the circle. Some truths poison the air when repeated. They traveled by rail, then on foot, through dying forests and fields still salted from a fire that happened 50 years ago, the fire that supposedly ended the Thorne estate. But Margaret's house was still there, barely visible from the road, choked in vines and rot, slouched like a dying animal, but alive, and more importantly, guarded. They watched from the tree line, 3 men with rifles, branded, not soldiers, not loyalists, claimed. Miriam whispered, "They don't patrol the surface. That's not what they're guarding." She turned her eyes toward the ruined barn. "The entrance is under there." Caleb knew it. He remembered the barn. He was 6 when he first saw it. Margaret had told him never to go near it. He disobeyed once, found a stone door buried in hay and ash, with markings carved into its face like jagged music. When he told her, she'd slapped him so hard his nose bled for hours. Now he understood why. That door wasn't just a relic. It was a gate. They waited until nightfall, slipped past the guards using a smuggler's powder Miriam had stolen from Josiah's pack, made it to the barn. Every step closer, the air grew heavier, not colder, thicker, like it resisted their presence. They reached the slab. Miriam knelt and pulled from her satchel a sliver of bone. Not human, curved like a talon. She whispered, "My brother stole this. It's one of the keys." She fit it into a jagged hole in the stone. It hissed. Then the door began to slide open. Not backward, but downward, as though the ground itself was swallowing it. The passage beneath reeked of iron and damp smoke, carved into the walls, names, endless rows, each one etched in blood and ash. But there was something stranger. Every name was followed by a date of birth and a date of return. Caleb's skin crawled. "Return," he whispered. Miriam looked down the steps into the abyss. Not resurrection. Reclamation. Then the door sealed shut behind them, and all light vanished. Darkness swallowed them. The stone door sealed like it had never existed, leaving nothing but the weight of ancient air. Miriam lit a match. It hissed and flickered, revealing the narrow tunnel ahead, walls soaked in soot, etched with thousands of names. Every name had a date of birth, and a second date marked returned. Caleb's own surname appeared 6 times before they reached the first chamber. Not Thorne, not Cartwright, but a name he had never seen on any census, in any record or family tree. Serath. He whispered it aloud, and the air grew colder. Miriam stopped. "You saw it too." Caleb nodded. "What is it?" She answered without turning. Margaret's real name wasn't Margaret, not in the beginning. It was just one of the names she took from the ledger. But the first name in this tunnel, the name carved into the altar below, it's the name of the bloodline. And the Serath bloodline doesn't die. They walked on. Eventually the tunnel opened into a cathedral of stone, far beneath the earth. No windows, no altar, only a pit in the center lined with teeth-like stone. Above it, suspended by chains, was a cage, and inside that cage, a boy, no older than 13, eyes open, unblinking, skin pale, lips moving, murmuring a chant without sound. He was marked with the same sigil as the ledger, the intertwined C and S carved into his chest. Caleb staggered back, but Miriam did not. She stepped forward, lit another match, then turned to the far wall, where the mural revealed everything. It was ancient, drawn in blood and tar. The mural showed a woman in black, offering a scroll to a rooted beast with no face. Its arms were like branches, its mouth a spiral, its eyes empty holes. Above the beast, a single word was carved into the rock, Vora. Miriam stared. Josiah translated this, she whispered. He said Vora was no demon. No, oh God, just a word from the old tongue. It means the one who repeats. Caleb felt something twist in his chest. It's a cycle, he realized. A feeding cycle. Miriam nodded. She doesn't kill because she wants to. She does it to keep him asleep. They both turned to the pit. Suddenly, from below, a breeze. Not air. Breath. Then a voice. Low, impossible, hollow as the abyss. One has returned. One has not yet chosen. And then the chains groaned. The boy in the cage opened his eyes wider and screamed Caleb's name. The scream echoed like it had come from the bones of the earth itself. Caleb! Not a plea, a summons. The chains jerked. The cage swung slowly over the pit, casting shadows like crooked fingers on the stone walls. Caleb stepped back, breath ragged. Miriam's hand shot out to steady him. He could barely speak. That boy, how does he know my name? Miriam didn't answer. She was staring at the mural again. Her lips moved, silent, as she traced the shape of a second figure hidden in the shadows behind the woman in black. Another child, not drawn fully, just the suggestion of a face. She whispered, "The cycle always claims two, one to serve, one to sleep." Suddenly, the boy stopped screaming. His head tilted, unnatural, like his neck had forgotten how to hold it straight. Then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was hers. Margaret's. You were never meant to run, Caleb. You were meant to remember. Caleb's knees nearly gave out. He felt the pressure in his skull, like a hand pushing from the inside. He'd been here before, not in dreams, not in memory, in blood. He remembered the ledger. His name was not written last. It was written first, then scratched out, then rewritten again, in a different hand. Miriam whispered, stunned. She changed your role. You were born an S sacrifice, but she made you a C, claimed. Caleb felt his pulse vanish into ice. What does that mean? The boy in the cage, if it was still a boy, and smiled. And from the pit below, the breath rose again. Warmer this time. Hungrier. The voice returned, layered with thousands of others. He was promised. He was pulled. He must return. Miriam turned, grabbed Caleb's collar, face pale with terror. That boy is your brother, Caleb. Not a sibling, a split. Margaret divided you, body and soul, to cheat the cycle. You were meant to die. He would, as meant to serve. But she wanted to save you both. The stone beneath them cracked, chains snapped. The cage began to fall, and from the pit, something rose, not a beast, not a god, but a root-born figure with no face, only spirals of hunger and memory. Vora, its voice was everywhere yet nowhere. The ledger is broken. Balance must be restored. Choose. Which one returns, and which one burns? The air shook. Stone split like bone. The cage crashed to the edge of the pit, its door flung open. The boy lay motionless, curled in on himself, whispering words in a language no child should ever know. Each syllable a spark, a curse, a memory not his own. Caleb moved forward. He didn't feel his feet, didn't feel his breath. Only the pull. Not toward the boy, but toward the truth. Miriam stood behind him, screaming his name. He didn't hear her, because in that moment, Caleb saw everything, not with his eyes, with his blood. He saw the night he was born. Margaret, kneeling in the sanctuary, her hands covered in blood, her voice raw from screaming ancient names. 2 infants, 1 body, 1 soul. But Vora demanded a single offering, and Margaret refused. She split the child, used the ritual of repetition, a forbidden rite that hadn't been spoken in over 1,000 years. She tore the boy into 2 halves, 1 to serve, 1 to walk free. Caleb, and the one in the cage. She rewrote the ledger herself, stamped both names in different ink. And for 70 years she held back the reckoning with blood, fire, and death. The S victims, the C survivors. They weren't random, they were substitutes, delays, until the spiral snapped back into balance. Caleb fell to his knees. The boy crawled from the cage, broken, eyes full of ancient knowledge no child should carry. He whispered, "I remember now. I am your pain. You are my freedom." From the pit, the spiral began to twist, slowly, like a storm forming in reverse. Miriam shouted, "Caleb, if you touch him, the decision is made. You merge, or he burns." Caleb looked at the boy, his mirror, his wound, his truth, then at the pit, then at Miriam. He whispered, "If I take his place, what happens to him?" Miriam's voice cracked. "He becomes you. He walks free. But with everything you have suffered, every wound, every guilt, every death Margaret delayed, he'll carry it all." Caleb looked back at the boy, and the boy, tearless, whispered, "I'll do it. I'd rather burn than become her." Silence. The spiral froze. Vora's voice fell to a whisper, "Choose." And as the wind died and the pit held its breath, Caleb reached forward. Not with hatred, not with fear, but with mercy. He touched the boy's hand, and the spiral exploded. Light, not firelight, not matches in the dark. Sunlight, warm, golden. Caleb opened his eyes to the soft hush of wind through trees. He was lying in grass, clean, whole. He sat up slowly, the weight in his chest gone. No screaming, no pit, no spiral, only birds. Sky, and a house. Familiar, white paint, wooden swing. No vines, no rot. The Thorne house, but restored. As if the fire, the rituals, the centuries of horror had never touched it. He stood, legs trembling, walked. A path guided him like an old memory made new. He reached the porch. The door was open. Inside, warmth. Laughter. A woman's voice called out from the kitchen. "You're back late again, Caleb. You'll miss dinner." He froze. That voice. Not Margaret. Not Miriam. But his mother. Not as he remembered her in fragments and fear, but alive. Smiling. Whole. He stepped into the kitchen. She turned. And for a moment, just a second, her eyes flickered with something familiar. A spiral. Gone before it fully appeared. She kissed his cheek. "Come on, wash up. Your brother's already at the table." Caleb turned. There he was. The boy from the cage. Only now, older, about Caleb's age, smiling, eating, breathing, wearing Caleb's face. But not quite. Subtle differences. His eyes were sharper, his smile thinner, his voice just a bit too careful when he said, "Welcome back, brother." Caleb sat across from him, fork in hand, but he couldn't eat. Something pressed against the back of his mind. A whisper, a rustle, from the woods beyond the house. He turned toward the window, and in the distance, at the edge of the tree line, a shape, not human, not beast, not God, a rooted figure, watching, waiting. And in Caleb's head a voice returned, balance restored, but the debt lingers. One spiral turns, another begins. The days that followed were almost real. Warm coffee, morning walks, a bedroom that smelled of old books and cedar. Every morning Caleb awoke to birdsong and silence. Every evening he sat across the table from a brother who wore his smile, shared his memories, but never once mentioned the pit, the cage, or the scream. But there were glitches. A mirror that wouldn't show his reflection, only the boy's. A neighbor who repeated the same sentence 3 times in the same tone, blinking too slowly. A dream where Margaret sat on the swing in front of the house whispering, "You made the right choice, Caleb." But he didn't. By the 5th day, Caleb felt it, a pressure behind the world. Like the whole place was made of glass, and something underneath was scratching to get out. The forest became louder. It no longer whispered. It called. One night, unable to sleep, Caleb followed the sound. Past the porch, past the picket fence, past the edge of the illusion. The deeper he walked, the colder it became. No birds, no stars, just trees, like ribs in a blackened body, and the sound of roots twisting underfoot. Then he saw it. A clearing, and in the center, a monolith. Black stone. The same symbol carved on the ledger, intertwined C and S. But now, joined by a 3rd spiral, O, he touched it. The stone pulsed, and a voice erupted behind him. "You weren't supposed to find that." He turned. His brother stood at the edge of the clearing, but his face was wrong now. It shifted with every blink. From Caleb, to the boy, to something older, something Serath. Caleb backed away. "What is this place?" The brother stepped forward, eyes gleaming. "A memory, a mercy, a prison. For you, Caleb." The monolith began to hum. The spiral spun, just barely, carved deep in its surface. "You're not a survivor," the brother said. "You're the remainder. The part Margaret couldn't destroy. So she buried you, here, inside the mirror of a life you almost had. Because out there, you're something else now." Caleb stumbled back. The trees began to shake. The forest hissed, and the monolith cracked, a light emerging from inside. Not warm, not divine, just familiar. Like the flicker of a match in a tunnel beneath the world. The light inside the monolith grew brighter, but it did not shine. It throbbed like a heartbeat. Caleb fell to his knees, clutching his head. Memories poured in. Not his own, but possible versions of himself. He saw himself as a priest, a murderer, a boy burned at the stake, a woman screaming beneath black water, a baby with Margaret's eyes and no mouth, thousands of lives, thousands of spirals, each ending the same way. The cycle turns, the pit opens, the ledger bleeds. The brother stepped closer, not grinning now, not mocking, but pained. "You were the seed, Caleb. Not the sacrifice, not the survivor. You're the reset. The spiral didn't die when Margaret sealed the pit. It moved into you. The forest began to fall apart. Trees disintegrating into ash mid-air, sky cracking like porcelain. Behind them, the house burned. Not in flame, in reality, collapse. Caleb clutched the monolith as it split open. Inside was not a heart, not stone, not fire. It was a mirror, and in it, Caleb saw his reflection. Except the spiral wasn't behind him. It was inside his eyes, twisting, alive, hungry. He screamed, backed away, but the brother didn't follow. He simply watched, and said, "There is no door out, Caleb. You are the door now, and it's opening." Suddenly, a sound. New. Miriam's voice, crackling through the trees like wind through dead leaves. "Caleb, if you can hear me, follow the sound. You're still anchored. You haven't turned yet. But if you stay, the spiral will take shape in you, and then nothing can stop it." His heart twisted. "You need to remember who you were. Not the roles, not the cycles, not the ledger. The man. The one Margaret tried to protect by turning him into a weapon." Caleb looked back at the monolith. The mirror inside was melting. His face was becoming something else. Not monstrous, not evil. Just infinite. He turned and ran. Branches whipped at his face. The brother, or what was left of him, stood still as the world around him crumbled. And as Caleb crossed the threshold of the forest into the void beyond the edge of illusion, he woke up, gasping, bleeding, alive, in the real world. The pit was gone. The house was ashes. Miriam sat beside him, holding the scorched remains of the ledger. Her voice was dry. "You brought it back. The spiral lives again." He stared at his hands, unburnt, unbroken, but marked now, with the sigil CS. And now, oh, it started with the wind, wrong cadence, wrong smell, like the forest had rewound itself. Birds flew in reverse across the sky. Ashes of the Thorne house drifted upward, rebuilding mid-air. Not just restored, rewound to decades past. Caleb stepped out of the scorched ruins, the sigil still burning on his palm. Miriam stood frozen. She whispered, "It's not over. It's widening." The spiral was supposed to be contained, bound by ritual, by blood, by Margaret's unspeakable sacrifices. But now, with Margaret gone, there's no firewall. The spiral doesn't die. It propagates, through grief, through trauma, through memory. And Caleb? He was remembering too much. He walked to the well, the one Margaret sealed decades ago after the first return. It was open. Inside, water. But it didn't reflect him. It reflected a girl, young, blonde, crying. Sarah, the first name in the ledger, the first girl Margaret sacrificed. Caleb's voice cracked. "You're not real." She looked up, eyes wide. "You weren't either once. You're only real now because Margaret needed a shape to hide her sin. She made you from her shame." The water exploded upward, and Caleb stumbled back. From the mist, bodies began to emerge. Not zombies, not ghosts. Perfect recreations. Sarah, Michael, Diane, Thorne children, Margaret's husband. Even the boy in the cage, younger again. Each one blinked at Caleb, alive, confused, but all bearing one subtle mark. The spiral in their left eye. Miriam pulled him back. They're not souls. They're echoes, spiral-born. They remember their deaths, but they blame the wrong person. They'll come for you. He shook his head. I didn't kill them. No, she said. But you're the one who made them possible. The sky bent. Not darkened, bent. Like a lens warping. Time bent with it. Old radios crackled in abandoned houses. 1952, and the Serath family declares a harvest festival. A phone rang in a nearby field. Rotary. Cracked. Caleb answered. Margaret's voice on the line. You think this is freedom? This is my punishment. And now it wears your skin. He dropped the phone, ran. But the road had changed. Back to cobblestone. The signs read, Thorne Hollow, 1899. And from the woods behind him, the spiral-born children began to sing, their voices layered, repeating, unbreaking, once for sorrow, twice for sin, thrice for what you let back in. The spiral is awake, not in the pit, not in the ledger, in Caleb's presence. And now it's rewriting the past to fit the future it wants. The spiral-born children scattered when the church bell rang, a sound too clean for this broken place, too deliberate. It came from the old meeting house, half-rotted, hidden behind overgrowth. Caleb ran. Inside, silence, dust, bones, books stacked to the ceiling, all bound in black twine, and 5 people in a circle, eyes covered, hands bleeding, chanting. One spoke as Caleb entered. He walks, we wake. Another. He bleeds, we bind. And then the oldest one looked up. Her eyes were gone, but she smiled. Caleb Thorne, she said. We were waiting. They called themselves the Unwound. Survivors. Not of Margaret's betrayal, but of her drafts. People she used before she perfected the spiral. Experiments, memories rewritten, bodies severed from time. Identities fractured, reassembled, abandoned. One man remembered 2 childhoods, born in different centuries. A woman remembered drowning every night, in every life. One girl claimed to be Margaret's first mirror clone, a failed copy aged in weeks, then discarded. They lived in dead zones, pockets of the world where the spiral's influence couldn't complete its turn. But they were decaying. Not physically. Historically. Photos of them would blur. Their names vanish from records, even their children forget them. Only one thing anchored them now. Caleb. Because he was the final wound. The one Margaret never meant to open again. The old woman reached into her robes, pulled out a second ledger, older, bound in Margaret's skin. Inside, diagrams, glyphs, theories. But also, formulas. Designs for something called S0, Spiral 0, and next to it, a birth certificate. Caleb Thorne, date of origin, NA, designation, S0, self-propagating memory host, notes, cognitive bleed must be monitored. If he awakens, all mirrors fracture. Caleb dropped the book. I'm not even real, the girl shook her head. You're not natural. You're engineered. But that doesn't mean you aren't real. It means you're the only one strong enough to stop her. Because she made you to replace her. The old woman stepped forward, placed her hand on Caleb's scarred palm. Do you feel it? The pressure in your chest, the pulse that isn't yours. That's the spiral feeding. It doesn't want chaos. It wants completion. And the only way to complete a spiral is to close the loop, which means you go back. Back where? To the pit? To the origin? No. To the first choice. To the moment Margaret made the spiral. Because that's where it locked itself into history. And if Caleb can get there, if he can unmake the decision before it spirals outward, he can collapse the entire design. But there's a price. To go back, the woman whispered. You must die forward. Let go of this time, this flesh, this identity, and fall. She opened a book, spoke a word older than language, and the world fractured. Caleb's body tore from his shadow rose, took shape, and smiled, because it remembered the pit, it remembered the cage, it remembered being Margaret's last sin. And now, it would become her first. The world reformed like wet clay. Not shattered, but sculpted. A farmhouse, a field, dusty air, thick with bees. Caleb opened his eyes. His hands were not his own. They were rough, weathered, marked with calluses, not scars. A dog barked. A child ran past him, and behind them, in a yellow dress, Margaret. But not as the witch, not as the mother of horrors, as a girl, smiling, alive. He staggered back. The old woman's voice echoed faintly in his skull. You are not Caleb here. You are the seed before the spiral. The man whose death birthed the entire curse. That night, he read the journals in the attic. Not spiral-bound, not cursed, just ink and paper. Margaret's first entries, her dreams, her fears, her obsession with keeping life from leaving her, and her love for him. John makes me feel like the world won't break. If I could just bottle that, keep him with me. Forever. John. That's who he was now. John Ashford. The man whose death, in a fire Margaret couldn't stop, would drive her to dark knowledge, to forbidden resurrection, to the spiral. And here was the trap. If he dies, the spiral begins. If he lives, she still builds it to keep him. There is no safe path. Only a single, precise moment, one line in time, where Margaret must choose to let go. Or everything turns again. Caleb, as John lived the days, loved her, played his role. But each moment cut deeper. He saw the signs. Her obsession with patterns, her fear of endings, her growing interest in ancient diagrams scrawled into the dirt. One night she said, "Do you believe we get to come back? That if we die wrong, the world gives us another chance?" He wanted to lie, but he couldn't. "No," he said. "I think death is the only honest thing left." She cried. Not because it was cruel, because it meant she would lose him, and in losing him, create everything. The fire came sooner than it should have. An accident, or maybe something deeper. The spiral, hungry to fulfill its loop. The barn ablaze. Caleb standing in the doorway. Margaret screaming from the field. "No, don't go in. I'll fix it. I'll fix all of it. Just don't leave me." He turned, and for the first time, he stepped back. Let the fire take the building, but not him. He lived. She ran to him, cried into his chest, and whispered, "You stayed. Now I won't ever have to let go." And that's when he saw it. In her eye, a flicker of the spiral. It had already begun, not from death, but from love that refused to end. The spiral's truth was never grief. It was refusal. Refusal to surrender, to end, to die. And now, with Caleb alive, she would build it anyway, to keep him, to trap him, to make him forever. The loop wasn't broken, it was rewritten. And he was still inside it. Only now, he would have to make a new kind of sacrifice. The next morning, everything was too quiet. Margaret hummed in the kitchen. Chickens clucked outside. Sunlight danced on the floor. Caleb sat at the table, barely breathing. Because in her eyes, he saw peace. And in that peace, he saw the origin of the spiral. Not in sorrow, not in madness, but in hope. A hope that he would never leave again, that he would stay, that they would last, that death would blink, and Margaret would win. He saw it now. The spiral didn't start as a curse. It started as a promise. One she made to herself. If I love something enough, I will not let it go, even if the world breaks. That night, Margaret showed him something. A sketchbook. Inside, crude diagrams of loops and symbols, dreams of repeating time, of anchoring the soul. I had a dream, she whispered, that you died, and I couldn't follow you. But if I found the right shape, the right pattern, I could hold you in place. Caleb's voice cracked. Margaret, that's not love. She smiled. No, it's more than love. It's survival. The spiral was never a monster. It was a devotion so strong it became monstrous. And now Caleb saw the truth. He couldn't talk her out of it. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't die for it. He had to become what she feared most. He had to betray her. Break her heart before the spiral was born. He planned it at dusk. Left the ledger pages where she'd find them. The journal where he wrote, "You must learn to let me go. This is not our forever. There is no forever. Only the gift of ending." He waited in the woods, watched her read it, watched her break. She screamed, cursed, tore the pages apart. And then she lit them on fire. "You're wrong," she cried into the trees. "There's always a way. I'll find it, I'll make it. You can't leave me again." Caleb stepped out, eyes full of sorrow, voice like a whisper. "Then I already have." The moment shattered. Margaret dropped to her knees, and something in the air shifted. A silence older than time. The spiral, the echo of it, hung in the air, waiting to spin. But this time, it didn't. Because she made a different choice. Not to resurrect, not to remake, but to grieve. The spiral is a loop. It only survives if we refuse to end. And for the first time in her life, Margaret let the story end. But for Caleb, that ending would be final. He felt it immediately, the world collapsing around him, not in fire or ruin, but in release. The field faded. The farmhouse flickered. Even his body, John's body, began to vanish. And Margaret, weeping in the grass, whispered, "Maybe next time. Maybe in another loop." But there would be no other loop, because Caleb had done what she never could. He let go. His final thought wasn't of vengeance or victory. It was of peace. And then, silence. Miriam Thorne awoke with no memories of him. No voice in her dreams. No flashbacks. No scars. The mirror was clean, but something felt missing. She stood in the center of her apartment, surrounded by familiar things. Photos, books, even the old red thread she'd once used to map the spiral across her wall. But the thread was slack, disconnected. There was no pattern, no spiral, no Margaret Thorne. She checked her files, her hard drives, the documents she had obsessively tracked. Empty, no Project Pit, no ledger of skin, no Caleb. Just one note written in her own hand. "You are free now. But remember him." The world had changed, slightly, subtly. The town of Ashfield was still there, but the church was just a ruin, never rebuilt. The children who once bore the spiral's mark were now just normal. No whispers, no flickering eyes, no bleeding walls. But deep underground, something rested. Not alive, not cursed. Just buried. She traveled back to the field, to the place where the farmhouse once stood. Grass grew undisturbed. No ashes, no foundation. But Miriam knelt and began to dig, hands trembling, not out of fear, out of instinct. And after an hour, she found it. Not a body, not a relic. Just a small, burnt page, folded tight, and written in faded ink. The spiral ends when we let it, but the wound remains. So remember us. Miriam sat in the field for hours, crying without understanding why, until the sky turned purple and the stars blinked on. She looked up and whispered, "I remember. I don't know who you were, but I know you loved us." In her dreams that night, she saw a man without a face and a woman with golden eyes standing at the edge of a fire. They said nothing, but behind them, a spiral turned in reverse and slowly unwound. The final scar was healing. But Miriam knew, somewhere in the soul of Thorne, he whirled. The spiral would always be waiting, not to trap, but to remind that love without loss becomes obsession, and memory without pain becomes fiction. It begins, not with a scream, not with blood, but with a notebook, weathered, blank, and waiting. Miriam sat beneath the old elm tree at the edge of the Ashfield field, the same place where the farmhouse never stood, in a world that had never burned. She opened the first page, wrote the first words. This is not history. It is memory. It is what the world had to forget to survive. Because the spiral didn't just end. It was erased. No books, no bodies, no names in forgotten institutions. Margaret Thorne, never born. Caleb, never found. Even Miriam's own past had been rewritten, clean, sterile, untouched. And yet, she remembered, in shadows, in dreams, in echoes when she looked too long at certain patterns. It wasn't memory anymore. It was inheritance. And someone had to record it. She called it the Ledger of Ash. Not a book of rituals. No cursed pages. No diagrams to open doors. Just a story. The story of a woman who loved too deeply. Of a man who died more than once. Of a world that almost became a loop with no end. And in the final chapter she wrote, "If you're reading this, then the spiral is stirring again. Not as a curse, but as a lesson. We are not meant to be infinite. Our pain matters because it ends. Our love matters because it must. And the only thing that saves us is letting go." She buried the book in the field, not out of fear, out of faith. Because if the spiral ever rose again, it would be in the hearts of those who forgot to grieve. And this time, maybe, they'd remember how. In the distance, a child laughed. Somewhere a star fell, a spiral of light across the sky, fading. Not cursed, just beautiful, and gone.